Okay, so everybody, I'm Sadhaka, your host. This is Circle of Spirit, Gay Questions, Sacred Answers. So this is officially the first episode we're going to be able to record, so I'm glad we got all the tech issues ironed out. Today I have with me Benjamin Stimpson, who is an old friend of mine, super old. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. So you are, I'm not going to read your whole bio, but you are an award-winning UK-based writer, independent researcher, podcaster, public speaker on folk practice, occultism, medieval history, and British folklore. So I'm super excited to talk to you. Again, this is Circle of Spirit, and this is a queer-based spiritual group and podcast, and we all sort of know each other. Other people might filter in later, and there's another one. There we go. Perfect for that. Thanks for joining us, Jordan. We just started recording, so I'm just doing my little intro. Again, I'm Sadhaka. I am an ecstatic trance shaman. I used to do a lot of work in the sort of new age vein, sort of got away from that. I've had experience in Western occultism myself. I've been in the spiritual communities for about 20 years now, making videos and doing healings, energy work, and that kind of stuff. What I've noticed a lot recently is the mainstays and the people who join this group the most are actually a little bit older and have a lot of experience doing this kind of stuff themselves. So another focus of Circle of Spirit is going to be speaking to our queer elders. Specifically, this group is for the boys, for the men folks. That includes bi, trans, everybody who is male identifying, because what we're trying to do is create a space where we can just sort of let our hair down if we have it. I'll still let mine down when possible. And I've said it 1,000 times in the meetings before, but since this is the first time recording, I will just reiterate. We tend to be a minority within a minority. We're sort of on the fringe spiritually, we're on the fringe sexually, at least in terms of sexual identity and all of that. And so it's just not a popular thing to be a gay man or a queer man who is spiritual, like, period, you know? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a space for all of us. I have been hosting this sort of format of meeting for 3 years, and now it's turned into Circle of Spirit. So I'm super excited to have Ben joining me today, and we'll just go ahead and get to it. So how are you doing, Ben?
I'm doing fabulous. Yeah, I've had a month of being over in the UK now. I just moved a month ago, so I'm still settling in, trying to get myself readjusted. And this past week was the first week where I felt like I was actually, it was normal, it was home, this can be home. So I've been fabulous, yeah. And Pride is coming up, so there's various prides around going on. London Pride is coming up soon. Birmingham Pride is this weekend. So yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of connecting with the community over here.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I know you've wanted to get back to the UK for quite a while. I mean, that's always been your focus, you know. And you're an expert in British folklore. So what does that mean to you? Does it really feel like, oh, I also wanted to mention the book that you wrote, at least the one that I know of, is Ancestral Whispers. And I did kind of want to focus this interview on that kind of stuff. Now, I will be completely honest, I have not read it.
That's fair. I haven't either, so.
But I just wanted to focus, or at least start out the conversation with that. I've known for so long, we've known each other for years, you know, and I've known for so long that you had this sort of like burning desire to get back to your ancestral homeland. You know, like, what has it meant for you to be there? Is it really that spiritual connection? Is it, you know, genealogical, or what is it for you?
So yeah, so just so people know, we've known each other online for about 10 years now, and it's, you know, who I was 10 years ago, very different from who I am now. I've really gone through a journey over the past 15 years since I was working over here last time, and I think a big part of it was my own culture shock. So I moved to Canada when I was 8.5 years old, and you know, I really, like, I came from a place that I completely belonged. I grew up with the kids that I was in school with. I sounded like everybody around me. I was I was in the culture, right? I was belonging, I was a part. I didn't see any difference. I grew up with a speech impediment and had to go through speech therapy, but the people in my life made it so normal that I didn't feel different until I came to Canada. And when I came to Canada, suddenly I was British. Then the gays started when I was a teenager. Then the witchcraft started later on. And so it was like it was just a compounding of feeling different. And I didn't just move to, a big suburb somewhere with lots of people. I moved to rural Southern Ontario, like Schitt's Creek, but the opposite of Schitt's Creek. I went to Letterkenny. It wasn't Schitt's Creek. It wasn't welcoming. So anybody who knows Letterkenny, right? Like the guys in that show sound exactly and look like the guys that I went to high school with. So there were 18 churches in the small town of 7,000 people, and I didn't feel connected to any of them. And so then that difference really made me yearn for the UK. And what I've realized since actually coming here in the past month is how much of that was my own yearning to belong. And I had a kind of a spiritual moment. We went to a friend of mine over here, because I've spent years making connections over here online. And he came up and picked me up, and we went to the Rollright Stones a couple of weeks ago, which is about the same age as Stonehenge. It's a little smaller, but it's incredible, a huge, incredible place. And it was such a weird moment because it was both very, very normal, but very outside of time as well. Like going around the stones, you felt like you were outside of time, but also like sitting, 500 yards away was a family having a picnic. It's so normalized. So I realized how much of that sense of belonging was really me projecting onto this landscape. Oh, I belong over there. I belong over there. And I realized how much I belonged to Southern Ontario in a spiritual way, in a social way, and all of those things. So I feel like this whole process has been a lot about letting go of things that I've held on to for such a long time, wounds that I've been kind of left festering because it kept me going. So I'm kind of in a weird moment right now, I'll be honest with you. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you talk about the yearning, and yearning to belong. I think that's something that's come up a lot for a lot of people in this meeting that we've had, is that my own personal experience, I was raised in a Christian cult. I consider it a cult at this point, and I was very, very happy to get out at 18 years old when I was gay, and yet there was always that sense of wanting that community that we had, and like having all of the questions like wrapped up in one neat little package with a pretty bow on top of it, and just wanting to belong to something, that yearning to belong.
Yeah, that yearning for belong, that yearning to belong. I think for those people who have never had the issue of having to experience that before, I think that they're very privileged. I think that we all will. I think a lot of us eventually find ourselves in a position where we feel on the outside of something. Now, how we cope with that is what's going to then continue that trauma, right? Whether or not we feel like we need to, desperately need to belong to something, or if it's a shutting down and it's like, no, cutting off, that's out of our lives, right? I think a lot of people deal with it in both ways, striving to change who you are in order to fit in, or just being like, fuck that, I'm not going to do that, and then going on still trying to find that same thing but in other places, which is wrought with danger itself, but it's also wrought with or brings opportunity too.
What kind of opportunity? How do you mean?
Well, so I work as a therapist. That's also been part of my odyssey over the past few years. And training as a therapist and really speaking and working with other people's story has made me really appreciate how boxed in we can become. And, that can be from socialization, that can be from just feeling, at peace. That can also mostly come from that sense of just familiarity. This is what we're familiar with. There's no other context outside. We see that a lot with people in the United States in particular, right? Because people who have never left the United States don't understand how big the world is outside the United States. So the frame of reference
Yeah.
is that country, right? Same with England too. There's people in England who hate going to Europe because it's foreign. It's like, well, it's only like an hour over there. Like, what are you
It's
talking
right
about,
next
right?
door.
But it's exactly right. Same with Canada, right? There's quite a few Canadians who've never left Canada because, again, it's such a massive place. There's so much to offer. Same with the United States. There's so much to offer. Why would you, right? But that familiarity creates a trap. For those who are forced out of that familiarity, it creates the opportunity to see things through a different light and to explore, and that it's a shock, but then the rebuilding afterwards can create new possibilities. That's what I mean by opportunity. It's that frame of, you know, shifting paradigm.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've experienced a lot that myself, and just having that experience of being in a cult where everything is a certain way, and it's the intensity of it, you know, when you literally believe that you're the only chosen people of God on earth, and then having to break away from that is a complete and total shock to the system, you know what I mean? But then it just teaches you so much about yourself, which, you know, again, just brings me back to the sort of common experience that we have as queer folks. I think most of us grew up, whether we were spiritual or not spiritual, or belonged to some tradition or didn't, most of us grew up with that sort of feeling of like, wait a minute, I do not fit here, I do not belong. Somehow, even though I had this intense sense of belonging, I knew that I didn't make sense, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. So what specifically speaks to you with your ancestral connection to the UK? You know, it's like, is there something you can talk about with that?
I think so. So my experience of the UK
And your spiritual tradition, because, you know, you are a practitioner of, like, you know, folk magic
quite a
and
few things.
that kind of stuff. So, like, how does that speak to you?
Oh, it's a big question.
I know.
Well, so I think my spiritual journey has been this in parallel with my sense of wanting to find belonging. So I have studied Hinduism. I've studied or had um, the powerful experience of being involved with Lakumi Santeria in a very intimate way. I lived with my godfather and his partner, who were both gay, for a few years, and then continued the relationship with that. So I think that a lot of my spiritual practice that I've kind of took on for myself and explored has been gay affirming, has been queer affirming. The two are the same, right? So when it comes to my identity with the UK, I think it runs in parallel. It's that sense of belonging. It's that sense of feeling different, but also that sense of belonging. With the UK particularly, because, you know, with my ancestors, you know, I grew up in an area where everybody was related. Their ancestors were in the ground. Many of them were related to the founders of those places. Same stories all over the United States and Canada, right? Any settled country. But I didn't have access to my extended family or my dead relatives, right? So for me, you know, the way that I worked with the stories of folklore was as a way of proxy familiarity. You know, I come from Wales originally. My parents moved to Wales before I was born, but we have Welsh heritage, right? So for me, it was like, these stories are the culture. These stories are the stories of my people, right? And if stories that are mobile, I can take them with me when I'm taking the book of folklore with me, right? I think that was what was really comforting. Wherever I happened to be, in whatever place I happened to be kind of inhabiting or feeling not connected to, at least I could pull out this book and be like, no, this is where my people are, right? So it was a very theoretical sort of thing. It's almost like, you know, when you're a teenager and and maybe some, you know, people will understand this, living in the rural area, and you want so desperately to be part of the gay community. You see Pride Parade on television. You know, you might have a regional hub. For me, it was Toronto. I know for people in Michigan, it was Detroit. Like Chicago was the big one for people in the Midwest, right? Anywhere that there's a big gay community, there's a yearning for that. Those are my people. That's where I belong, right? And I feel very much similar with the UK, or at least the idea of the UK in my head when I was living in Canada and feeling miserable and alone, right? So So a lot of my kind of spiritual practice has been to affirm who I am and recenter myself in my own life, as opposed to constantly be on the outside in somebody else's story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
me
think
coming
it's an
back to the
important thing to
UK.
do, just so we somehow get away from the constant yearning and the need to belong or whatever. We do have to recenter ourselves and reframe our sense of self so that we know, like, honestly, our ancestors are in our bones, right? So it doesn't really matter where we are,
Mhm.
technically. But my
Yeah.
my partner was just going through something similar. It's like we've been down in New Orleans, which is an incredibly queer-friendly city, and it's just spread out everywhere. There's not specifically one queer area, one gay area. Where's the gay area of town? It's everywhere, and it's very accepting and very reaffirming. There's always a parade. There's pride flags everywhere on people's houses, and it's wonderful. But he grew up in this tight-knit little tiny rural community in Alabama. And so he's constantly like, where's my queers at? Like he doesn't, it's a completely different experience, because when you have everything centered like that, you just want it to be right there, but it's just a different experience. Just made me think of that.
I mean, and that's the thing, it is a different experience, right? But it's more of that, like for me, what I find interesting is the relationship to the idea of what the expectation is when you eventually get to wherever it is, right? So for me, I think it would be different. It would be different if I was born and raised in Canada and my parents had come from the UK. I don't think I would still have that relationship over here. But because I came from this place, I remember it vividly. I remember the landscape. I remember the just the feeling of how cool it is in the morning, right? The smell of the rain, all of those things, right?
Yeah.
That was familiar to me.
I'm sorry. I just find it fascinating that you moved to Canada at 8 years old and you still somehow managed to retain your Welsh accent.
Yeah, I know, right? I know. Well, and that's, I mean, it's interesting. That's part and parcel with kind of the feeling of lack of belonging. I was of an age where it could have gone one or two ways. My brother doesn't have an accent. He sounds like he's from Ontario. Yeah, he was a little bit younger than me. But I guess because I try to deal with this trauma of immigrating, in like watching TV that was British, trying to talk to as many people as I could who were British, right? All like British. That's kind of how I dealt with it, right?
Yeah.
And not really connecting with friends who were Canadian until a few years later, and by that time my accent was locked in. But I actually have 3 different accents. I do have a Canadian accent, and every so often I hear it come out. So like I can't say the town that I grew up in, or the town that my parents live in now without it sounding like Letterkenny. I can't do it, right? And every so often over here, I'll meet somebody who is North American or from Ontario, and suddenly it just comes flooding back, right? We're social mimics.
Yeah.
Right. We tend to be social mimics. So, people who pick up accents very easily, they tend to be able to, again, want to connect with other people. So they're not doing it consciously, and neither here. So when I was like, I spent the first week I was back in Wales and my Welsh accent came out. Now I'm in England. I hear very much my northern English accent come out, even though it's like everybody sounds different down this way because I'm closer to London. So it's interesting. It's that social mimicry sort of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really, really broad question, but it is something that I wanted to try to touch on as much as possible. You had this interesting experience, to me, it's interesting, of being in a place where you felt connected to the stories of your ancestors, the folklore. Wales in particular is just a bastion of that, just because they somehow have managed to keep their Welsh identity in the midst of all this other Britishness, which is fascinating to me in its own right. But then leaving a place like that and being in North America, Canada, or whatever, you had this yearning to go back, this yearning to belong, and you felt like there was a connection there that you were missing. What would you say to basically the whole, because you've lived in North America, so it's like the whole of, I almost want to say white culture. I know that's an overly broad term. It really doesn't mean anything. Like, for instance, me, I get characterized and treated like a white person And I do have that experience. I'm just a white American, but I'm also half Mexican, and I grew up with a grandmother who spoke Spanish all the time. Every time somebody would call her on the phone, if she was staying with us, it was in Spanish, and I feel like it's a particularly new thing. It probably applies to New Zealand and Australia with this like wave of Anglo-Saxon Americans, maybe German or whatever, but like the particular North American experience is like I have so much genetic history, and specifically speaking to the idea of how do we connect to our ancestors. I'm just like throwing my hands up in the air sometimes because I'm like, I can connect to my Mexican ancestry. I can connect to my English ancestry, my German ancestry. I have Dutch ancestry. I have Scotch-Irish ancestry. The more I look into it, I realize that Mexico in itself is incredibly genetically diverse. They have African influence, they have the native influence, they have Spanish influence. Then you go back to the Spanish and there's Moorish influence. It's just like it's this incredible thing, as opposed to something like I know there's a lot of different cultures like in the UK, but it's particularly just Anglo-Saxon or British or Welsh or something like that. It's a lot more homogenized in that sense. I remember years and years and years ago, I was talking to this guy. I was very young, and we were like pen pals back and forth. One of the first other gay people I ever talked to in my entire life. I was still a Jehovah's Witness at the time. We thought we were in love. It was very cute. But I was asking him, like, what's your genetic history? What's your heritage? And he was in the UK. I probably should have prefaced that. And I'm telling him about my Mexican stuff and the German and the Scotch-Irish and all this stuff. And he's like, I'm English. I'm like, yeah, I know, but like, what else? And he's like, I'm English, and that was just such a trip for me. It's just like, anyway, so that's a really long way to get to my point. It's just like, I have had so many people join this meeting over the past 3 years who were like, what ancestors? Like, which ones do I talk about? Like, how do you address that? And I know it's a big question, but
it's a huge question, so I do address it in the book. I think the most important point I need to make here, though, is that genetics does not equate to culture, and this is the most important thing for North Americans in particular, because there are so many issues with the North American ethos, and I've got my pen out and I'm making my point here. This is the problem, right? When we connect genetics with culture, it allows for a lot of appropriation to happen, a lot of assumption of relationship to happen, right? It also posits a very particular form of relationship, right? One of the things I love in my book and love generally in my ancestral work is there are more ancestors than just genetic ancestors, right? It's all about relationship, right? When we look at settled lands, particularly North America, particularly like we really talk about North America here, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, right? South America to some degree, and certain other parts of the world, but mostly those areas. There is this idea that white people don't have culture because of the homogenizing kind of effect of settled cultures. You have a lot of people in North America who are of mixed heritage, and so then it's, well, which one do we privilege? Right? And oftentimes that kind of white overculture says, oh no, you're white, right? I think what's really important here is that we understand that people of mixed heritage have that heritage, but that culture doesn't translate down genetically. It goes down culturally, right? Right. You go to certain parts of, like Virginia, for example, right? Appalachia has culture. Appalachia has a lot of surviving culture from, Scots-Irish and German and Potawatomi and all sorts of other cultures, right? Have fused together and have become Appalachian culture, right? That's something to be proud of. Appalachian culture is something to be proud of. But where people often get caught is this idea and this perception that, well, because my ancestors were settlers, therefore I don't have a right to call this place home. I don't have connection here. We don't have culture here. Therefore, they're pining for Europe or the old world, right? And that is a dangerous, I would say that's a dangerous way of looking at it, because when you start to look somewhere else, I'm proof positive. I did not respect Ontario the same way I could have done because I was pining for the UK, right? Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this in her book, about the difference between being indigenous and being indigenized, right? Being indigenous is a cultural heritage, a relationship to the land that comes with indigeneity, right? Being indigenized is having relationship while also acknowledging that your ancestors did not come from this place, right? You can have relationship with North America, with a settled land, if you acknowledge that no, your ancestors were part and parcel with the settlement of that land and all of the atrocities that came with it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you just throw up your hands and say, well, I don't have culture, I'm white, I'm actually from over there, then what you're doing is not only are you covering up the fact that your settler ancestors caused issues and literally came and took over the place, but you're also denying that you are part of that lineage. You're also ignoring the culture that they handed down to you, right? You're ignoring the folklore, the settler folklore, definitely, but you're ignoring the folklore and the culture of 300 or 400 years, right? You are robbing yourself and you are robbing other people of that, right? So I think that that's really important to understand. For me, when it came to my connection with the UK, it's because I'm from here. Like literally, this is where I'm from. But when I look around Ontario and I look at the folklore traditions and the relationships that white settler culture has with that place, there's also a relationship there, and that relationship is important because, again, acknowledging the reason why that culture exists in the first place, but also knowing that it goes back 200, 300 years too. And so when you have a relationship with the place that you're in, you're going to respect it. And there's also an opportunity to then relate to the relationships that other people have with that place, that their ancestors may go back more, 16,000, 20,000 years, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's such a difficult question, and it's such a difficult topic to get into, because I know a lot of people who I almost assume that the connection to the land is in some ways separate from the culture and the people who grew up in it or whose people have been there for a very long time, because I do think that the earth feeds us its energies, and there are very unique properties that certain places can have. Particularly here, I notice a lot of white people or people with very mixed heritage tend to, in the spiritual communities, feel very attractive to Native American or Indigenous American ways of believing and feeling and spiritually, and the relationship that they have to the land and the sky and the earth and all of that kind of stuff. And yet we don't feel comfortable getting into that because it's not for us, it's for indigenous peoples, kind of a thing. Does that make any sense?
It makes total sense. And the reality is that it's not for white people, right? It's not for white people unless those communities have made them accessible, right? Or you go through the process of initiation. And I speak from, having experience with a predominantly Black tradition that originated in Cuba that was created because of the slave trade, right? My godfather in Lukumi, he's now 22 years crowned Oshun, and he went through that initiation process. He did his year in white. He was he still has connections with his Madrina, and those connections go back to Hialeah, and then on to Cuba, and then on to Osun, right? So, but he worked hard to become part of that community and to be a bona fide member of that community. So when it comes to him practicing, he practices as an insider. Where people get it wrong is trying to practice something as an outsider, right? And that's any community. The amount of people in North America, and I'll go there. Why not? The amount of people in North America who have Celtic heritage, who believe that because they have Celtic heritage, they have a right to then take up the mantle of that culture over here, is a problem. Same with any of the other European countries.
It's rather disturbing. I'll say this as a sort of cultural anecdote to people just randomly. If you go into any American bar and be like, hey, who here's Irish? You will have at least half of the people be like, I'm Irish, and they'll just start freaking out because of how Irish they are. And I'm like, no, you're not. You might have Irish blood in you, of course. You have that history, you have those genetics or whatever, but you're not Irish per se. Just try to plop yourself down in the middle of Ireland and see how they feel about that.
Well, and then this is where it becomes a question of identity and how words are used and whatnot, right? So, like the Irish diaspora in North America, particularly, same with the Italian diaspora, has a very strong sense of community tie, right? So when somebody says, I'm Irish or I'm Scots-Irish, they're looking at the history over the past 150 years, 200 years, right, of being in North America.
Right.
A lot of those traditions have carried on down because they have certain structures like the Catholic Church, which is assisting with kind of community, the community rituals being perpetuated. The history of oppression, right? No Irish in here, right? So it's that sense of communal connection, but it's not the same as if you came from Ireland. The same thing happens with Quebec, like Quebecois francophonie up in Canada, right? I think they understand it a little bit better than the other diaspora groups because they've been here for so long, or there for so long, right? If you ask somebody, are they French? They'll say, yeah, I'm Quebecois. But you'll say, well, you're French. No, I'm not from France, right? They understand that distinction, right? But I think it's the people who don't have the benefit of coming from an established community identity in North America, people who, their great-grandparents came from Wales, for example, and they want to connect with their Welsh heritage and they start calling themselves Welsh. Well, you're not Welsh, you're not from Wales. You can learn about it, you can become part of the Welsh diaspora community, but you can't claim an identity that's not yours. Right. So it becomes a question of looking at each individual group. Another example would be the fifth generation Chicano community in Los Angeles, right? You say, are you Mexican? Oh yeah, I'm Chicano, I'm Mexican. But many of them may have never been to Mexico, right? They may have distant relatives in Mexico, but they are very much north, like very much United States Chicano members of that community.
Right.
So it's that starting to separate from kind of the origin place and the new place, and how much that affects individuals. It depends on the individual and their relationship to that other place, right? I think another good example of this is individuals who have indigenous heritage but did not grow up on reserve, right? They may have that genetic history from 2, 3, 4 generations back, but they can't claim indigenous heritage. They can't claim indigenous identity, and certainly indigenous groups would not look at them as being members of the community. They have the opportunity to become part of those communities. So again, it's that active relationship building. And by relationship building, then you join that living community. That's what's really important. The ancestors give down that culture to the next generation, who then create and recreate that, who then pass it down to the next one. Outsiders, people who have become disconnected, it's unfortunate, but the opportunity there is to see what you actually still have, right? Or to step in and to, with humility, come and become part of the community. The same with gay community too. How many times have we been in a bar and a little twinkie teenager kid comes in, first time in a gay bar, and tries to kind of, become part of a gay community in the way that they think they should, because they've watched Queerest Folk, because they've watched, Will and Grace, or whatever it is, and they make assumptions about how they're supposed to operate in those spaces. Same with straight allies. They make assumptions about what they're supposed to be doing in that space, or how much space they can take up in that space, and it inadvertently disrespects that living community. I think that could be a good analysis point there too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've all had that experience. I know that, and so many people, just because I think of the way gay culture is portrayed in the media, especially when we're young, come into those spaces and think we have to act a certain way in order to belong, in order to be a part of it. Same thing with the spiritual community. Is okay, well, I'm supposed to don the native headdress and beat a shaman drum and that kind of stuff just to belong, or make sure I'm doing it right. Which it kind of brings me to my next point, actually, is like one of the things that I've noticed in these meetings over the past 3 years is that the majority of us are North American, first of all. The majority of us also seem to be eclectic in every sense of the word when it comes to our spirituality. And so we've picked up a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We've picked up some, JP says, Yas, Queen. We've picked up like for me, I call myself a shaman. I'm an ecstatic trance shaman. And I've had people in the past say, you can't use that word. That's only for such and such people. You're not native. I'm like, well, actually, I have native ancestry. So if that's the only thing that matters to you, blood, then I can call myself a shaman. Thank you very much. Also, I don't think it matters. It's just a word. It's just a way of categorizing the practices that I engage in, and that kind of thing. But I find that people find it very difficult to either become a part of any specific groups because of the cultural stuff, or because of the history of that, or because they don't really trust organized spiritual groups in general. Most of us come from some version of Christianity also, especially. And once we, realize that we're gay, we're different, we're queer, we're on the fringe normally, then we just start exploring everything, And so I kind of want to characterize it into that, like, how do we speak to people who have picked up a little bit of the, Celtic witchcraft, folk traditions, who've picked up a little bit of the Native American style, because literally it is all within us, our experience, especially someone like me, I'm split between a European mutt and Mexican. And I've found myself relating to the Mexican heritage that I have spiritually a lot more than anything else that I found in Europe, And a lot of people would be upset about that.
Right. Again, it comes down to relationship, right? It sounds like you have a stronger relationship with that part of your heritage, but I also suspect, knowing you, at least knowing what I know about you, you've done the groundwork to build relationship with those things, right? It's not like you're just showing up and being like, La Llorona, come and hang out, right? You're not doing that, right? I mean, maybe you are. I mean, it's up to you. I wouldn't do that myself, but but I think it's that, like, whenever you come out of that familiar, right, it's that sense of trying to, again, it depends on the person, trying to recreate what you've lost, trying to find new opportunities. Suddenly that paradigm has just shattered, and so it's forming a new paradigm, right? And I think as social creatures, we're hardwired to look to seeing what works, what is stable, what is right? Especially coming from a Western, individualistic Protestant culture, such as the West is, right? We're constantly looking for what is correct, what is right, what works, because that's all part and parcel with, being a success, being an individual. We put so much pressure on, at least culturally, we put so much pressure on being a successful individual, particularly in North America, that we don't know necessarily how to be in community. So when we find ourselves outside of a community, suddenly it's like that searching for community. What do we find in the New Age pagan Wiccan community? we find people who are also on that journey, right? At least that's what I found. I found some really cool groups where, like, I remember going to my very first big pagan festival. I'm not talking about like pagan pride. This was a bona fide like festival, 150 people, and it was a little bit later. It was only about 10 years ago, and I was like, I found my people. But as I started to open my mouth and talk about some of the things that I was interested in as a solitary, suddenly I found they were all well aware of it. So suddenly it was like, who am I now? Who am I now? Right. So it was like, yeah, it was, you get so, yeah, exactly right. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but could you remind me of the question, please?
No, I think so. It's just, how do we deal with eclecticism? Because I think as queer people who are on a spiritual journey, sometimes that's the only way we can approach it. Is okay, well, I'm not comfortable with the Christian stuff. Maybe we've had abusers in the church. We're not comfortable with authority figures. And so we don't necessarily want to belong to any type of group. And I think more often than not, when gay men or gay people, queer people in general, start to get back into spirituality, it's a little new ageism. It's a little shamanism. It's a little, witchcraft. It's a little of this and a little of that. So
I think, I'll be honest with you, like, since becoming an author, I've connected with a lot of other particularly gay occult authors, right? It seems like most of the male identified people who are writing, if you go into Llewellyn, onto llewellyn.com, or you go into any of the bookstores and go into the metaphysical center section, you will often find a lot of queer men particularly writing. And having connected with a lot of them now myself, it seems like we go through certain developments. Those of us who are approaching 40, for example, we were watching the same TV shows back in the 1990s and early 2000s. We often had very similar sort of interests. We have very similar sort of feelings of ostracization or issues like that. And so I think I think that it is a developmental thing. We go through that searching and that seeking until we find what works for us, all the communities that we feel we belong in, right? When we meet other people who have gone through those journeys as well, and I speak for myself here, I felt less lonely on this journey when I actually met a lot of people who had very similar journeys to me. It's people like Matt Oren, David Salisbury. We're talking about people like Storm Ferrywolf, right? Devin Hunter. I just name, right? Very similar stories, very similar eclecticism, until eventually we land in those places that we can go deeper into. And I think that's also an age thing too, right? I think a lot of queer and gay men, we were robbed the ability, those of us of a certain generation and older, we were robbed the ability to have those kind of social rites of passage, right? I know like some of my friends came out when they were in their 40s and they're acting like teenagers because they're catching up, right? They're enjoying themselves, but they're trying to hit those marks that we might have had when we were a little younger. I think that generationally it's different now. A lot more people are able to come out as teenagers and go through those very specific societal benchmarks than we of a certain generation did. So I think when we look at kind of eclecticism, I kind of theorize that that's part and parcel with that exploration phase, right? That Rumspringa, if you want to call it that, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so yeah. Another friend of mine over here in the UK, his name is Moss Matty. He just came out with a book, The Apostate's Guide to Witchcraft. He comes from a similar background to you. He was born and raised in Jehovah's Witness, and only like 6 years ago was he ostracized. And like a lot of his family will not speak to him. He's reconnected with some of them, but he talks about that in his book, going through that devastation of being thrown out of being a witness, because he dared to think that he could go and study psychology at university, right? It literally just came down to that.
Oh my stars, no.
Right. So he talks about what it was like for him the first year, 2 years, kind of exploring, being eclectic. He's Welsh, but also a German background too. So for him, his spiritual practice is very grounded in Wales. He's a Welsh speaker, but also a German speaker too, and his reconnection with German folk traditions, spirituality. So that idea of like running around, trying to find things that acknowledge who we are, who bring us up, and then landing and going deeper. I can certainly feel that for myself. It was, when I think about the spiritual practices and the figures, the gods, the deities, the spirits that I've been attracted to over the past 25 years, a lot of them were affirming of me as an individual, all parts of me, not just my queer side, not just my, nerdy side, not just my British side, but all of those things. So, I like quite a few of the deities that I connect with. Hermes, for example, a very liminal, outside of time sort of deity, right?
Right.
Also a deity of transaction, because I've had issues with speech in my past. I've had being neurodivergent, I see things differently. I think of Shiva, for example, right? The destroyer. I went through a period of destruction and keep going through those periods of destruction and recreation over and over and over again. I can see his hand in my life, right? That affirms that experience for me. I think, I suspect that a lot of people in this room, when really pressed, will look at the spirits or figures or practices that they deal with, and it will affirm something for them. Making assumption here. Don't come at me. Don't send me wrong emails. Don't send me.
No, I can already see the angry comments in the chat. No, I'm kidding.
How dare you, bitch?
Dare you work with Hermes? That's my deity. No, yeah, I agree. I actually never really thought about it that way, honestly, but I think you're right. A lot of the, specifically just talking about beings to work with, higher beings, divine beings, or whatever that I've worked with in the past have always been, to me at least, comfortable with the gay thing, comfortable with the solo path, comfortable with something that's a little bit weird. I've had New Agers come at me in the past for working with Kali or whatever, because she's about death and all of this stuff, and you don't want death programs in your field, honey, and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, that's not what it's about. Different things like that, or Krishna, working with Krishna. I just feel like he's absolutely cool, bisexual kind of spirit to me, or whatever. Go ahead, you were going to say something.
Well, so it's interesting, because I think there's a sense there of affirming one's identity and forming relationship with spirits that are going to not just outright dismiss you, right? What I'm also seeing, though, and there's a trend now within traditional witchcraft, folkloric witchcraft, of reclaiming Catholicism, reclaiming folk Catholicism, and part of that speaks to, I think, that ancestral interest there. But I think also part of it, when you actually look at the saints that folk witches are connecting with, it's that they're fine. They're seeing past the official church statements, and they're going straight for the relationship with individuals. And the individuals are fine. Oh yeah, you suck dick, that's fine, right? You know?
Oh, yeah. I myself work with Santa Muerte, and she gets a really bad rap, because it's like, drug dealers go to her in Mexico, and it's like the lowest of the low, and it's all that kind of stuff. Again, it's the relationship with the person and the being that we're talking about. When I connect to her, I get this, like, it's like my abuela, like she's just this loving, perfectly accepting, doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, any of that or whatever. And that just has more to do with the spirit to which I'm connecting and the energy that I'm cultivating within myself and in my own life than it has anything to do with Catholicism. I wasn't raised Catholic. My grandmother was Catholic. She converted to Jehovah's Witness when my family was very young, so it's just like no connection to that whatsoever. And yet I feel a connection to this being,
Yeah, and they prove it, right? Like, my experience with Lukumi and Espiritismo really opened things up for me. And these are traditions that come from a very machismo culture, right? Cuba and Nigeria and a lot of Caribbean and South American cultures, very machismo when it comes to that. And yet these are the traditions that a lot of queer people will go to, right? In Brazil, you have, Candomblé and the other Orisha traditions. And, the great Orisha, Oshumare, the rainbow spirit, literally. A lot of queer people are washed to that particular spirit, right? Same with in Cuba, a lot of gays are can be found in the priesthood because that was the place that was safe for them, right? So you have Oshuns, you have Yemayas, you have Obatalas, you have Eleguas running all over the place, and they're all sleeping with each other. Same with prostitutes and members of and sex workers were often found in the priesthood too, because those were the only places that would be welcoming. So then you have, these really machismo, priests who are made in Miami of a Cuban background, who are very anti-LGBT, very homophobic, and they're daring to say that their tradition is anti-homosexuality, when so many of the priests in their own lineage probably were of a gay persuasion, right? So it's a very cultural thing, and it's an issue, but all of them have different relationships with those beings, and all of them are welcoming. So
right. Well, I think it's so interesting as a lot of queer people are getting back into some form of spirituality and also embracing, let's say like an Episcopalian church or whatever, which is completely accepting of LGBTQ people. Monasteries and nunneries used to be bastions of homosexuality. It's like,
true.
Again, you have the same experience. Okay, I don't necessarily fit into this cultural paradigm, so I'm going to go with a bunch of other mans and sit up in this place and figure out my relationship with God. I'm like, you still have that desire, that yearning to get to know God, because this is what everybody has told you is the best thing you could possibly do. And yet you don't fit into the narratives that you've been fed your entire life. You don't fit into society. You don't fit into your traditional culture. You don't want to marry a woman and have kids. So it's like, what else are you going to do?
And go figure that those monasteries is the place that the occult arts flourished and survived. That was the place that grimoires were created, right? After the fall of Rome, monasteries were, and then eventually the scholastic institutes, were the places that the occult books and practices and that ceremonial tradition was perpetuated. Right, so you have these people who didn't necessarily fit into a heteronormative, Christendom society, going into these places that they did fit in, that they often would have relationships with their brothers, literally, and then they were also practicing occult and conjuring spirits, and it was all in the name of God, right? They very much related to, when. It's sort of gone by the wayside, but as a medievalist myself, I can say there are so many writings from monks in that tradition who speak to themselves as brides of Jesus, in the same way that nuns talk about themselves as brides of Jesus, right? It's very interestingly similar to how Vaishnavas and members of the Bhakti community in India and South Asia talk about their relationship to Krishna as a gopi, right? That idea of them, they are the consort of Krishna, regardless of if they're male, third gender, or female, right? So it's a really interesting thing. I think mysticism in general, again, because it's so direct, it's so relationship based with the divine, I think that's where a lot of LGBT flourish, I think.
I think you're right. No, it's beyond gender at that point. It doesn't really matter. I think even I can't remember his name, but he was the Hare Krishna guy.
I
think he had somebody come to him and say, something about gender or whatever. Eventually his point was just, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're a guy who likes guys, a woman who likes women, whether there's any sex involved in it at all. when you connect with the divine and you're in that devotional state, that bhakti, everything dissolves anyway, you know.
Very much so.
Try to get people into that, you know.
And I think when we look at the particularly gay male organizations such as the Minoan Brotherhood, the Unnamed Path, the Temple of Antinous, right, certain like radical fairy groups, right, all of them come to that same conclusion, that sexual union piece, and you know, let's go there, right, that sexual union piece is a form of mystical experience. You get to that white light in the same way that ecstatic dance, ecstatic drumming, any kind of ecstatic activity, it's no longer just about sex in that moment. It's about then opening yourself up and that mystical connection. And I'm not a member of any of those organizations, but certainly have very good friends who are, and they often talk about that relationship with the divine in that sense of a union. So that very mystical. It just so happens that it's through that lens of you know, the gay male experience, right?
Right. Okay, so I probably should have done this at the beginning, but when we do these meetings in the past, I would ask everybody to just kind of like give us their background. Like, how did you start your spiritual journey? I know that's a huge question. You could possibly say, oh,
Okay.
I've always been on a spiritual journey. Who isn't on a spiritual journey? But, you know, for me, it was like once I got out of the Jehovah's Witness organization, I devoured everything I could find on yoga and shamanism and psychedelic experiences and everything I could get my hands on, witchcraft, everything. So I don't know, but I had a what's the word I'm looking for? A trigger moment, you know, when I suddenly decided, no, I'm not going to believe in this stuff anymore because I fell in love with a man. And that was what I was taught was God. I was taught that God was love, and he who does not know love has not come to know God, because God is love. That's in the Bible. And so when I had that experience, I was like, this is the most intense love I've ever experienced in my entire life. Everything, tower moment, you know, everything came crashing down for me. And so then that's what I say propelled me into searching other forms of spirituality. What was it for you? You know, how were you raised even to begin with? Yeah.
So this is where it gets a little complicated, because, you know, British culture is not religious. It's not like the United States, where you know, religion is so on people's minds. Over here, it's like some people, a lot of people only go to church maybe 4 times a year, for christenings, for funerals, for weddings, or for Christmas, because they happen to be like doing a buy, right? So I grew up in a household that was not really connected with the church. You know, like I remember going to a Baptist March break school, because it was, you know, literally a way to get us out of the house. So it was just like free babysitting for a week, right? So, you know, I never really
Bible camp kind of a thing.
It's a Bible camp, exactly right. And that was only because the local church like had a little like minibus that would pick up all the kids on the estate and, you know, take us to church. So it was lovely. It was lovely, but it wasn't a religion thing for me. And that, I think I started to become interested in spirituality through folklore. So when I started to explore and read about the fairies and like, you know, King Arthur, for example, which was like fantasy was all over the place on our screens back in the 1990s. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all of those. It was when I watched The Mists of Avalon, the TV movie. It was made based on the book. Suddenly it was like, oh, there's a mother goddess. Oh, she's cool. I like this. This is interesting. And it was also part of my culture too. It's like, oh, this is interesting. Let me read more on that. So I found Witchvox. I started going down the Wiccan, kind of eclectic Wiccan point on Yahoo and Dogpile and all those, like, you know, old search engines.
The early years.
The early years, yes. And I was like, this is really interesting to me. And around the same time was also when Harry Potter came out. And as a kid, imagine me, but smaller, with big glasses, and, you know, English accent and all. What do you think the kids called me? Harry Potter, right? So I was like, so I started to become really interested in this idea of, okay, we can actually do magic. That's really interesting. Oh yes, of course, Kristen. Thank you for joining us today. So I started to explore, started to look into it, and I actually met a few people through Witchfox. One of them I was crushing on hard. So when I was 15, 16, I met him up with him, and he was a couple of years older than me, and I was just like, oh my God, like my first teenage crush, right? And he really impacted me. So I continued studying, met a few other people. So by the time I got to Toronto when I was in 1920, I was able to go to the occult shop. I was like embedded in this, and I just kind of continued. It wasn't until I was about 27 that I joined a big, like, actual pagan group, and they were working with the monomyth and Joseph Campbell's monomyth, and being in a ritual of 60 people at midnight, completely silent, us just in space and connection with each other. That was what really did it. I'd studied Buddhism, Hinduism on my own. I'd erected altars to deities, all of that. But it wasn't until I was in community with people that it started to really become a big thing for me. And then a few years later, it was Lakumi, and then that tradition is still very important to me. But now that I'm over here and I was gearing to come back over here, folk magic and folk tradition has become a big part of my work. Also continuing again with Hermes and Shiva and some of those. So really it was folklore that got me into it, because I was coming from a place of not feeling and belonging. And then I found that I belonged. Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. Okay.
It's ironically around the same time that we met you. I started watching you on YouTube. That I was starting to join up with these groups and really flourish and grow and expand. So there was a definite yearning there. But it was all online. It was all solitary. And then when I found myself actually embedded in a group and embedded in community and relationship with people, that it started to be like there was a challenge there too, because suddenly there were people there who would give alternative points of view. And it was frustrating for a while, because when you're solitary for a very long time, you form your own opinions and your own way of seeing things. And when that can become that can become a echo chamber very quickly. Yeah, it can become a hindrance. Yeah.
No, I've experienced that myself in the past too, or even just coming through it. I'll look at my journals and the different practices that I go through and that I outline, and I'll do this, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do this. I almost think if I went back and compared everything that I did, I would see the same patterns emerge of the different styles that I go through. I'll start with like the devotional stuff and just the connecting to that like heartfelt connection with the divine. And then I'll go into the more shamanistic, ecstatic stuff, and it's just, one thing down the list. I'm like, okay, let's put it into a cohesive whole, then find the tribe, All right, so I just kind of wanted to open it up to everybody, because it is getting late and we're some people are starting to filter out. So I just kind of wanted to open it up for questions, comments, anything about the stuff that we've talked about so far. Feel free to go ahead and raise your hand or just chime in, and we can have a discussion about things. And also,
do we want to go through the messages first? There's a couple of questions in there we can start with, unless people want to have a burning question right now.
David needs to leave as well. Yeah, maybe next time I'll get to the questions earlier. Some of them are so many as questions as comments and different things, going back to tolerance and intolerance is an epidemic, and you can find no common ground. Yeah, so they're just like, in reference to the things we were talking about in the moment. Peter wanted to know about performative identity. I don't know if you can speak to that.
I can, yeah. I think that's a really important question. I think that, I've certainly had my relationship with this idea of performative identity, and the pendulum swung this way and that, right? I certainly roll my eyes when I see somebody dressing up, and it's very apparent that it's a costume as opposed to a form of their own identity, like an expression of their own identity. But I think that knee-jerk reaction really just comes from an understanding that I was there at that place too once, and probably still am. Like, I can't say that I'm not still in that place in some ways, right? I think that it comes down to wanting to belong. We want people to recognize us. We want people to connect with us. So that, sometimes that performative identity is more of an invitation to come closer than it necessarily is to say, look at me, right? Look at who I am, look how important I am, or whatever the case may be. It might just be a way of wanting to show that who we are inside. And I think that everybody will eventually get to that place of feeling comfortable enough to show with discernment who they are, whereas not necessarily become something different than what we actually are. So I think that there is place there for it, but I also think that it can be also a distraction too if people over attach to that identity that is performative in nature. I also think that it can be a safety blanket for some people, right? Creating a visage, a mask that can be employed so that people don't really see who you are, so that there's a certain safety there. Yeah, I hope that answers the question, Peter.
I'm sure it does. And you can come on the chat now and unmute yourself if you just want to speak freely.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the process and all you guys talking. And I wanted to know, have you gone to the Chalice Wells? Have you visited?
Not yet. It's on my list. Yeah, there is actually. So I was in London last weekend visiting friends from Reno who were over for the OBOD gathering. So I'm a member of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and they have their annual gathering this year in this coming weekend. They're actually all hanging out right now. They've gone up the tour. But yeah, I am planning on going down to making pilgrimage to Disneyland, because Glastonbury can be a little bit more a bit like how New Orleans is, right? Or like Salem is. It's like very touristy, but it's also has those sacred sites there. So yeah, I do want to. Yeah. Oh, have you been?
No, I haven't, but I'm really drawn to. And I know in past lives I've been there. Yeah, because the UK has such a ley lines and dragon ley lines that are really powerful, and how dragons are really a part of their heritage.
Yeah, they're everywhere. The feeling over here, you can feel it. Like I said, when I went down to the Rollright Stones, it was both in and outside of time, right? I'm like being in North Wales too. Like, we went to quite a few places when I was staying that week, and they were all very familiar to me. But when you see them through that lens, you can feel it, right? So it's powerful landscape. Landscape. Yeah.
And thank you so much for just answering my questions, and Sadhaka too, about performative identity. I think that performative identity comes down to sometimes not even it could come down and trickle down to ego and how we identify ourselves, such as the healer, such as the roles we play, even transactional performative identity. If you do this, then I'll love you. If you don't do this, I won't love you. And that's so ingrained in our society, and in the gay culture, and also even you don't even have to be gay. If you do this, that's conditional, and transactional. Yeah. And then that's really why I think I've noticed with myself, why I perform, my wheelhouse in performative identity, I know, is as a man to perform and provide. That can be very how do you say it? As a man, that can be very narrow. Yeah. So yeah, what do you guys think about that, Jordan, JP, Sadhaka, about the performative transactional
Well, one thing I was thinking about when Ben was talking about it was just like this. It's sort of like the simplest form of it is when you're in high school or younger and you just want to belong, and so you start dressing like a goth or something like that. When we're talking about the spiritual, side of it, the worst part of it to me can be, cultural misappropriation or appropriation, and some white guy dressing like a shaman and putting on traditional Native American garb and dancing around, and having absolutely no connection to that culture and no initiation, like Ben was talking about earlier, not doing the actual groundwork. What I went through in Boulder, Colorado is there's just this like intense gotta belong to the spiritual tribes, but it's all just performance. It's all just this surface level, white girls with dreadlocks, and you got to wear the perfect yoga pants, and everybody's wearing bracelets and all this stuff. And it was just so pretentious and surface level, kind of stuff. And so I don't know, that's just the stuff that I was thinking about it. On the other side of it, I think it really does speak to a human need, again, that yearning to belong and that learning to identify yourself in some specific way that really feeds the soul, and to figure yourself out to begin with,
Yeah, I really like that. Because at the end of the day, a lot of our gay brothers are twisting themselves into a pretzel to be seen and loved. And yeah, I think that there are spiritual tools that can alleviate that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like Ben was saying earlier, just real quick, just like, going through a phase when you're just coming out of the closet where you feel like you have to flame out, because that's how gay people are supposed to act or whatever, and it's like, I'm not really gay acting, but I'll turn it on. Or like, again, you're just around people who are a little more loose or whatever, or a little more effeminate, and suddenly it all comes out. And to me, it's just this sort of adaptability. It's not about performance anymore. I don't have to be that way to be gay. It's just a part of my personality at this point.
Yeah.
It's like code switching.
It's code switching, exactly, right? It's thank you flapping. It's it's all of that. It's the signal that you are safe and that you belong and that you all of these things, right? I think that we have to be very cautious with that, though, that it doesn't become then bypass. And this is certainly an issue with any kind of spirituality, is that bypass spiritual tools and spiritual approaches, and even that taking on a masking can be a form of bypass. And then you lose connection with yourself, right? And we've certainly seen that with like Boulder, Colorado, right? Those white girls running around with dreadlocks, right? There is so much bypass in that, or potential for bypass. Same with even any tradition, right? I look at some of the TikTok people now who are taking on the garb of the traditional witch. I am the witch of blah blah blah, right? I am, the witch of Northern Light or something like that, whatever it is. And it then becomes a performative statement that when you really look closer, there isn't anything there. In which case, then they're attached to that persona and are then using that persona to delude other people into following them. And then it just becomes an attention seeking. That's not a healthy thing at all, right? So I think that there's a discernment there, but everybody has their own journey with it, and everybody has their own place. And, it's not our place to judge, but it is our place to be discerning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I remember when I was up in my cabin and I was living up there solo. I had just gotten out of a horrible relationship, and I was like, fuck everything, I'm moving to the mountains, and so all I was going to do, I was going to monk out, literally. That's what I was calling it at the time. And I just wanted to do my spiritual practice, do my work to keep myself afloat and have my food delivered and just focus on personal cultivation. I bought this like orange monk robe, just to have something to wear during my practice. And after a while, I was like, this is not me. Like, why am I wearing this? Like, I can just wear jeans and a t-shirt and I'm fine, But there also is something, just to speak to the opposite side of that, there also is something special about having a special kind of garb or clothing or the accoutrement of magic or whatever, and getting into that too. There's a certain power in that,
But it depends on what your relationship with it, right, is. Like, for you, it sounded like that it wasn't you. It wasn't like taking on that garb didn't feel connected to you. And I've certainly been there myself. I remember the first time I went to Wiccan Fest up here in Canada, I dressed up like I was like a, like a Chinese Kung Fu kid. I have no idea why. Like, I have no idea why, but I was just wanted to belong and I just wanted to be seen.
That's okay too.
It is. It is okay,
But it was like you were saying, though, it was a different feeling a few years later when I was embedded in a spiritismo, and one of the kind of the garbs is wearing white. So whenever I put on my white clothing and I sat on my boveda, or just spent a day in white because I needed that cleanse, going about my daily business, going to Walmart, going to Target when we still had Target up here, in white, it just felt like, okay, no, this is just a natural extension. Like there's a purpose here, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I found myself a lot being in harem pants. Often I'm in that. And it's because it's comfortable for me. I'm in the RV. I don't need to be in jeans all the time. Actually, it feels very uncomfortable being in jeans. But I also have the thing, I'm technically, I say technically now, I'm a Jedi cleric. So I do have Jedi robes, and I've worn them twice because it just isn't part of my need. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the wedding I performed, I was in harem pants. I was in my big bright orange harem pants instead of doing that. So it really just does. I agree with Ben, is that it really does depend on what feels natural to you.
Yeah.
I'm wearing beads. I'm not today. I just saw them. I'm like, oh, they're not on. But that's natural to me, and it's part of my practice and part of what I do. So
it's normalized, right?
Yeah.
It's normalized. It's not performative in that way. You're not wearing it for other people to see you wearing it. You're wearing it for you, right?
Right.
That's a good point too. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're just doing it to be seen, then it can become another thing entirely.
No,
well,
that's the
okay.
Moo I'm buying.
Okay, so we're at an hour and a half, so I think I'll just go ahead and wrap it up at this point. Everybody else is gone. Thank you for everybody who stuck through
Thank
it.
you.
It's been an awesome
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. It was good. It was very good. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm definitely going to have you on again, and we'll put together a list of some other questions and other topics that we can cover. Specifically when it comes to queer spirituality, obviously that's what we're trying to do here. But I really appreciate you getting into a lot of the cultural aspects of things, because it can be such a difficult issue, especially North America is such a mixed bag of cultural influences and genetic influences, and so many things are happening in our lives and in our culture right now that people have especially the younger generations too, they have absolutely no idea what's going on. They do not feel a sense of belonging, but of course everybody wants to belong to something, and so it's a very mixed landscape. It's a very difficult landscape for people to navigate. So I appreciate you bringing your experience and your wisdom, and we'll connect more.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in having some of the people I'm connected with, like if you'd like to have Moss on, I'd be happy to introduce you. I think that he would be a really cool person to speak to. There's a lot of opportunity there. So I certainly would love to come back. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any information or where people could go to get more information about this? Because you talked on colonial mentality and assimilation, and I think a lot of people are having that. So
there's a lot of really cool conferences that are going on now. So there are two big events that I would highly recommend that generally speak a lot on this. So one is the Salem Folklore and Witchcraft Festival, and that's organized by Matthew Venus up in Salem. He has some excellent speakers. I'm also coming and speaking too. This coming year's theme is around magical endurance in hard times. And so he really, they really posit to have diverse voices there, which was really excellent. There's also down to you, SassyCon, which has just opened up, but Sean Wilde, who sorry, I'm assuming everybody's in New Orleans just because Sadhaka is. There is another event in New Orleans called SassyCon. There's also Austin Witch Fest, which is excellent, and they tend to have a lot of discussions around this as well. So some excellent events going on. Otherwise, there's many speakers of both a neo-pagan background and a traditional background that are speaking on this too, and definite reclaiming. So there's so many avenues there. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Ben, if
I
people
can
wanna
put you
get
guys in
with
touch too if you want any specific links or anything like that. So don't worry about that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, so JP, my website is benstimpson.com. Everything's on there. My podcast is on there too. I have a whole podcast, 78 episodes, particularly speaking to queer authors in the pagan metaphysical field, occult field. So that's also there. That's Essence with Ben Stimpson. But yeah, benstimpson.com is where everything else is. So
awesome.
Perfect.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks again for
Thank you
being
so
here.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.